Alright, today we're going to be working on a 2008 Mazda RX8. I'm replacing the lower intake manifold gasket. Of course, this is a rotary engine, and the gasket that we're going to be replacing is the one that's located in between the motor and this lower intake right there on the bottom side of this engine assembly. So we're going to go ahead and remove all this to access it, and once we replace it, put it all back together and we'll fire it up. Alright, with the air cleaner removed, the battery removed, and your tray, it's going to pretty much expose some wiring. This wiring is your battery wiring, and also the wires that go up into your fuse box right here. You're going to remove those two little screws right here. Go ahead and cover it back up, or set the plastic cover to the side. And you're going to remove the batteries, the battery cable, separate it so we can go ahead and drop this motor and training that's on the K-member. And then you're going to go ahead and start working on the intake that expose all your cooling, your wiring up underneath here. So that's going to require you to remove your cooling lines. If you still got coolant in here, make sure it's drained out. You're going to remove your cooling line here, your cooling line up underneath here. You got your throttle positioning sensor. You got a sensor right here. You got a vacuum line right here. You're going to have another one that's actually attached here, this little guy. You're going to have one on the vacuum port right here. And then there's three wires. You can see them disconnected already. That's just lying back there. They actually mount on the back of this. And then you're gonna start unbolting your intake. Little 10mm bolts. You have 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, and you have 2 additional ones back here by your oil filter. So once you do that, this whole upper intake manifold is going to uplift and up and out. It's then going to expose your lower intake and all your wiring. And then we'll start the labeling process, however you want to do it. I've done this quite a few times, so I'm not going to label it. But to those that never really worked on doing motors, unless you're experienced, I would recommend labeling. All right, as we progress forward with removing the intake manifold, you want to ensure that all your wiring that you have down here, you go ahead and label. Like, you're going to have 6 injectors that's down here, and I go ahead and label it 1Y, 2Y, 3Y, 4Y, 1R, 2R, so you know where everything goes when you go to reinstall in the intake. All the wiring and the hoses. So with the hoses, you could also color code it. If you want to go ahead and wrap the ends with the color dot if you want, and where it's receiving area, put a blue dot on the vacuum lines, pink dot, so you kind of know exactly where everything goes. Because when you go to remove the intake, you're going to have a bunch of wiring and vacuum ports and cooling lines, and you might mix some of this up. So label, and that way everything can go back easier than trying to look for a wiring schematic or a diagram of exactly where everything goes. So that will help you out in the long run. Pretty much do this. It is not a hard job. You will need a hydraulic jack and 4 jack stands. Primarily, once you go ahead and pop your intake, to start the process of lowering it, you will have to remove your AC lines, your heater hose, your fuel lines that run along on the side right here, all your cooling connections, all your clamps that run along any of these ports will have to remove. But before you go removing your coolant or your hoses, you need to remove your coolant. You got 2 transmission lines right here, these 2. You have a oil line right here. You have one right here. They're held on by 2 little clips. You have your steering shaft, right? Once you go ahead and remove those, you then got your air box that sits right here. He's in the way. Go ahead and remove that guy. You're going to remove your strut bolts. Do the same on this side as well. Once you go ahead and remove those, it's gonna, let's see what else. You're gonna have to remove all your electrical connectors from your intake, of course. And as you can see, my motor and transmission is still bolted together with the torque arm all the way to the back. You will have to remove your shift linkage from your shifter itself. That's the only thing that's down there that you will have to remove. Everything else pretty much stays in the same position. Now once you go ahead and start lowering, you're gonna lower it with the jack. And make sure your jack stands are located on the frame of your car. And your other 2 jacks are gonna be on the K-member. Like so. Notice I don't even have the head on here. If you have the head, it's gonna be too high. I went ahead and just put the lower portion, and it pretty much gave me about 10-inch drop from the top of your strut to the strut area mount on the body. 10-inch drop, and that's gonna allow you access to getting the intake slide out and up around back to the top side. So you'll be able to pull it out directly this way. This is the original one that came off of the RX8 engine that we have right here. And this is another one that I had inside my shop. I just wanted to go ahead and show you. I went ahead and placed a new intake gasket on here. There are 4 12mm bolts. Once you remove it, it pretty much looks like this with the cylinders. You go to remove it. You want to go ahead and ensure that the surface is not damaged. You want to go ahead and clean it from any debris, any old gasket, and get it ready for the new intake gasket. You're going to go ahead and place it on, install your 4 bolts, then this little guy is going to be ready to install on the motor. But on the motor side, you want to ensure that you get the surface clean as well. That way, when the intake is installed, it's kissed and flush, and you won't have to worry about any intake gasket leaks. I'm going to go ahead and install the intake. Remember, it's a tight fit, but you're going to install it from above, and it's going to fit right in there like a glove. All right, went ahead and got that intake reinstalled. It's bolted to the motor. Just a little tip, when you go to install this, ensure you put a little bit of oil on these little cylinders right here. When you go to slide in the motor, remember the intake has to come from the top side. It slides right in here and then goes directly into the engine. As long as you got them lubed up a little, it'll make it a lot easier when you go to slide it in there. So all the bolts that are down here, they're all 12mm. You have 2 bolts here, 2 on the bottom. You have 1 right here and 2 over here on this side. And just a little tip, when you do mess with the intake, if it doesn't want to move over here, you want to make sure this little flap right here and the one right here, you pry it against the transmission so that way the intake could actually pull itself out. So if it does get stuck, that's your little deal, and then bend it back and then bolt it back down. So intake is installed. We're about ready to go ahead and raise this K-member back into its position and re-bolt it back into the original spots, which bolts right here. You got the 2 nuts right here. Same with the opposite side, and then the cross member up underneath it. So we're gonna go ahead and start lifting it back into its cradle. Lifting it back up, you wanna ensure you keep the K-member pretty leveled. You do not want it to be tipping toeing back and forth. You have a possibility of breaking your motor mount. I would recommend you removing the bolts that's on the motor mount, the center bolt. That way the motor can actually have something to rock itself on. As long as you lower the K-member straight down, you shouldn't have a problem. Once it finds itself sitting on top of the jack stands, and then when you go to lift it back up, you want to ensure that you lift it straight up. I used 1 large jack right there, and I went ahead and used a small jack to support the back side. That is this little guy. The bolts, of course, you have 1 bolt right here, and you have 1 bolt right there. They're 19mm head or nuts, and then you have the cross member down here. You got 17mm bolt heads and 19, the one that goes from the K-member up into the body of the car. Once you go ahead and torque those down, that pretty much secures it back. But when you are lifting it straight up, the struts are actually going to hit the body of the car first. So you can go ahead and put those nuts back into place first before any of the bottom ones. And these are 14 millimeter nuts. Tighten those up, tighten the ones on that side, raise the K-member as straight as possible. And also a tip, when you go to remove your steering knuckle shaft right here, mark it with a permanent marker. That way it goes right back on exactly the way you pulled it off when lifting the K-member back into its place. All right, went ahead and after getting the motor up, went ahead and rehooked all the coolant lines. Of course, you remember at the beginning of the video I said make sure you mark them. Of course, a lot of these hoses are pre-bent, so it's pretty much common sense to put them back in their correct area. And what I do is I drain my coolant into a catch pan and I reuse it. But what I would suggest when you go ahead and re-put your coolant back inside the cooling system is get yourself one of these strainers. As you can see, I drained the coolant, and this is what I strained out of it. So I would highly recommend getting a strainer to filter out your fluid before putting it back in the motor. And went ahead and reinstalled the air pump. Of course, you have a nut right here, these two bolts, and this pump comes right off. Reinstall it the same way. Air hose right here into this valve, and you got two nuts that are way at the bottom. Those are two 10 millimeter bolts that's at the end of the pipe. You can go ahead and get to it from right inside here, which is pretty simple. When you go to do the intake manifold surface and you clean it, go ahead and clean that surface as well, so that way it's got a good, clean, fresh kiss to go ahead and made it back to the engine block. Now we're going to go ahead and work on installing the air intake box, the few wires that's right here, and the battery, and she should be ready to fire up. Alright guys, with the motor installed, as long as you tagged all your hoses, your electrical connectors, everything where they needed to go, everything should have went right back the way it should have before you started. But it's always good to double check your work, making sure everything is hooked up, nothing is left loose. All your electrical connectors, your hoses, your coolant hoses, your hoses down below. Make sure you got no leaks underneath the vehicle. And when you go to fire this vehicle, because we went ahead and removed this intake, if you actually noted, there was 4 clear hoses that had oil running to them, to vacuum ports. Those are to pull the oil from below from your oil pump. So they lost their prime. So I would suggest getting a gallon of gas, put some oil mixture in there and dump it in your fuel tank, and then go ahead and prime your fuel system so there's oil in there and you don't start this vehicle up dry and it's primed until that oil reaches from the pump to the motor itself. So we're gonna go ahead and fire it up. Should be done. Hope you all enjoyed the video. If there's any questions or concerns that I might have missed out, go ahead and comment and I'll try to get back to you as quick as I can. So hope you all enjoy the vehicle. Thank you.